The orbital station hung in the darkness between stars like a jewel crafted by gods who had long since forgotten what mortality meant. Ambassador Daniel Cooper stood at the viewport of his small quarters and watched the ships of a dozen species drift past in silent procession. Each vessel was larger than anything humanity had ever built, and each one carried representatives of civilization that had mastered the stars when humans were still learning to plant seeds in dirt. Daniel was 53 years old with gray at his temples and deep lines around his eyes that came from a lifetime of smiling. Earth had chosen him specifically because he did not look like a warrior or a conqueror. He looked like what he was, a former teacher who had stumbled into diplomacy, because he genuinely believed that any two beings could find common ground if they simply tried hard enough. His wife Corinne had kissed him goodbye at the departure terminal 6 weeks ago. She had straightened his collar and told him to remember that the galaxy was watching. He had promised her he would make humanity proud. Now standing in the shadow of ancient powers, he was no longer certain what that promise meant. The summons came through his communication device as a chime that echoed in the small room. The Galactic Council was ready to receive humanity's representative. Daniel took a deep breath and stepped out into a corridor that stretched for what seemed like miles in either direction. Beings of every shape and composition moved past him without acknowledgement. To them, he was barely worth noticing, a creature from a world that had only discovered faster-than-light travel within the last century, a child stumbling into a gathering of elders. The council chamber occupied the heart of the station. Daniel had studied images of it during his journey, but nothing had prepared him for the reality. The room was a perfect sphere carved from some material that seemed to drink in light and release it as gentle warmth. 12 platforms floated at different heights around the chamber, and on each platform stood or sat or coiled the representative of one of the founding species of galactic civilization. At the highest platform, the High Arbiter waited. The Arbiter was a being of living crystal, its form shifting and reforming with each passing moment. Light moved through its body in patterns that Daniel's mind could not quite follow. This creature was over 9,000 years old and had presided over the council for the last 3 centuries. It had witnessed the rise and fall of empires that humanity had never known existed. Daniel was directed to a small platform near the floor of the chamber. He stood there feeling very small and very alone, as the council's attention turned toward him like the weight of mountains settling onto his shoulders. The High Arbiter spoke in a voice that resonated through the chamber without any apparent source. Humanity had requested this audience to propose terms of integration into galactic society. The council was prepared to hear these terms, though the Arbiter's tone made clear how little interest the ancient powers had in what a primitive species might want. Daniel began his presentation. He spoke of trade and cultural exchange. He spoke of humanity's desire to learn from older civilizations and to share what little wisdom Earth had gathered in its brief existence. He spoke of friendship and mutual benefit and all the gentle words that diplomats use when they want nothing more than to be accepted. The council listened in silence. Occasionally, one of the representatives would shift or make some gesture that Daniel could not interpret. He felt like a child reciting a poem for adults who had heard every poem ever written and found them all equally tedious. When he finished, the silence stretched for a long moment. Then the representative, a being like a great serpent wrapped in robes of woven metal, asked why humanity believed itself worthy of equal standing with civilizations that had achieved greatness, while humans were still hunting with sharpened sticks. Daniel answered that humanity did not claim to be equal in age or achievement. They only wished for the opportunity to prove themselves as partners rather than subjects. He believed that every species had something unique to offer regardless of how recently they had reached the stars. Several of the council members made sounds that Daniel recognized as laughter. The Arbiter raised a crystalline appendage, and the chamber fell silent once more. The council would consider humanity's request, But first, the human ambassador would observe how galactic civilization maintained order. It was important for primitives to understand the foundations upon which peace had been built. Guards brought her into the chamber. This one was smaller than the representative, and its scales had lost their luster. It moved with the slow heaviness of a creature that had already accepted its fate. Daniel watched in confusion as the prisoner was placed on a platform at the center of the chamber. The High Arbiter announced the charges. This had authorized the expansion of a colony beyond the boundaries permitted by council law. The expansion had resulted in no harm to any other species. No conflict had occurred, but the law was the law, and the law existed to maintain order. The sentence was death. Daniel felt his blood turn cold as the words echoed through the chamber. He looked around at the council representatives, expecting to see some sign of protest or hesitation. He saw nothing but calm acceptance. This was simply how things were done. The execution device descended from somewhere above. It looked almost gentle, a soft glow that enveloped the condemned like an embrace. The prisoner did not struggle or cry out. It simply closed its eyes and waited. The word left Daniel's mouth before he could stop it. He shouted for them to stop, and his voice rang through the chamber like a crack in ancient stone. Every being in the room turned to look at him. The High Arbiter's crystalline form pulsed with colors that Daniel had never seen before. The silence that followed was absolute. Daniel knew he should apologize. He knew he should bow his head and beg forgiveness for his outburst, but he could not make himself do it. He asked how they could call this justice. He asked how they could execute a being for a crime that harmed no one. He called it barbaric, and the word hung in the air like smoke from a fire. The High Arbiter spoke slowly, as if explaining something very simple to a very small child. Order required absolute consequences. Mercy was a weakness that bred chaos. Humanity's primitive notions of compassion were precisely why they remained so weak. They would learn in time, or they would be removed from the galactic stage entirely. The execution proceeded. Daniel forced himself to watch because looking away seemed like its own form of cowardice. The prisoner died in silence, and its body was removed as efficiently as cleaning dust from a shelf. That night, Daniel sent a message to Earth describing what he had witnessed. He recommended caution in all future dealings with the Council. He did not know that his single word of objection had already been recorded and analyzed and filed as evidence of humanity's dangerous instability. He did not know that he had just been sentenced to death. 3 days passed aboard the orbital station, and Daniel Cooper continued his diplomatic work as if nothing had changed. He attended meetings and submitted proposals, and smiled at beings who looked through him like he was made of glass. He told himself that his outburst had been forgotten, that creatures who had lived for surely had more important matters to consider than the words of one human diplomat. He was wrong. The guards came for him at dawn by Earth's reckoning. There were 6 of them, tall creatures with chitin that gleamed like polished obsidian. They did not explain why they had come. They simply gestured for him to follow, and Daniel understood with a cold certainty that his time had run out. The council chamber looked different now. The floating platforms had been rearranged into something that resembled an amphitheater, with Daniel's small platform placed at the very center. Every representative of every founding species was present. The High Arbiter occupied the highest position, and its crystalline form pulsed with slow rhythms that reminded Daniel of a heartbeat. The charges were read by an automated voice that echoed from the walls themselves. Daniel Cooper of Earth stood accused of violating Council Law 719, the deliberate spreading of seditious ideology likely to destabilize galactic order. The evidence was his objection to the lawful execution 3 days prior. His use of the word barbaric constituted an attack on the foundations of council authority. Daniel listened to the charges and felt something strange settle into his chest. It was not fear exactly, though fear was certainly present. It was something closer to clarity. He understood now what kind of civilization had built this gleaming station among the stars. He understood what humanity was dealing with. The trial lasted 4 minutes. Daniel was not permitted to speak in his own defense. The evidence was deemed sufficient, and the verdict was predetermined. When the High Arbiter announced that he had been found guilty, Daniel simply nodded as if he had expected nothing else. 12 light-years away on Earth, Corinne Cooper sat in the observation gallery of Fleet Command alongside Admiral Christopher Blake. They had been called to witness the final session of the diplomatic summit. The transmission showed the council chamber in perfect clarity, and Corinne watched her husband standing alone on that small platform, surrounded by ancient powers who had already decided his fate. Admiral Blake was a man in his 60s with a face that looked like it had been carved from weathered oak. He had commanded humanity's defense forces for 15 years and had spent most of that time preparing for a conflict that everyone hoped would never come. Now he watched the transmission with eyes that gave away nothing. The High Arbiter spoke the sentence. Daniel Cooper would be terminated immediately as a message to Earth regarding the consequences of defiance. The primitive species would learn that the Council's authority was absolute, and its justice was swift. Perhaps in time, humanity would produce representatives more suitable for participation in galactic civilization. Corinne's hand found the edge of her chair and gripped it until her knuckles turned white. She did not cry out or beg. She simply watched because that was all she could do. On the screen, Daniel looked directly at the transmission device. He seemed to know that Corinne was watching. He smiled the same gentle smile that had made her fall in love with him 30 years ago. Then he spoke the last words he would ever say. He told the council that if compassion was a crime, then humanity pleaded guilty. He told them that mercy was not weakness but strength. He told them that one day they would understand or they would fall. Then he straightened his shoulders and waited for death with the same quiet dignity that had defined his entire life. The execution was swift and clinical. The same soft light that had taken the prisoner 3 days earlier descended upon Daniel Cooper. He did not flinch or close his eyes. He looked at the High Arbiter until the very end as if he wanted the ancient being to remember his face. Then he was gone. The transmission continued for 6 more seconds, showing the council chamber returning to its normal business as if nothing of importance had occurred. Then the feed cut to static. Corinne sat in silence. The tears that streamed down her face made no sound, and she did not bother to wipe them away. She was thinking about the man she had married, the teacher who had believed so deeply in the goodness of all living things that he had given his life for a principle that these ancient creatures considered worthless. Admiral Blake stood slowly. The officers around him were frozen in shock and horror, but Blake moved with the calm purpose of a man who had been waiting for this moment longer than anyone knew. He walked to the central console and entered a code that only 4 people on Earth were authorized to use. Lights across the command center changed from blue to deep crimson. Alarms began to sound throughout the facility, and then throughout every military installation on the planet. Blake spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the room. Earth was declaring extermination protocol. The room erupted into chaos. Officers shouted questions and objections. Some argued for restraint, for measured response, for diplomatic solutions that might still salvage the situation. They pointed out that humanity was outnumbered and by an almost inconceivable margin. Blake silenced them with a single question. He asked what measured response was appropriate when they had murdered a man for asking them to show mercy. No one had an answer. Within the hour, every human vessel in the galaxy received the same coded transmission. Ships in deep space changed course. Hidden installations powered up systems that had been dormant for decades. Factories that had been secretly producing weapons of war began operating at full capacity. The message that accompanied the activation code was 3 words long. Remember Daniel Cooper. Karen remained in her seat as the command center transformed around her. She watched the officers rushing to their stations and the displays filling with tactical information. She listened to the communications chatter as humanity's scattered forces acknowledged their orders. Finally, she stood and walked to Admiral Blake's side. He looked at her with something that might have been sympathy, but his expression did not soften. She asked him what extermination protocol really meant. She asked him what her husband's death had just unleashed upon the galaxy. Blake told her that for the past century humanity had been preparing for the possibility that the galaxy would prove hostile. They had hidden their true capabilities behind a mask of primitive harmlessness. They had developed weapons and tactics and strategies that no other species had ever imagined. The Council believed they were dealing with children who had barely learned to walk. They were about to discover that humanity had been running all along. Karen looked at the crimson lights and listened to the alarms and thought about her husband's last smile. She asked Blake to make them understand what they had done. The Admiral nodded once. Then he turned back to the displays that showed the positions of every human vessel in the galaxy, and he began to give orders that would change the course of history. The Galactic Council received Earth's declaration of extermination protocol with something close to amusement. The High Arbiter reviewed the transmission and made a sound that its species used to express mild entertainment. The primitive creatures were throwing a tantrum because one of their own had faced the consequences of defiance. The mathematics of the situation were simple and absolute. Humanity possessed 47 combat vessels scattered across a handful of systems. The Council's combined fleet numbered over 12,000 warships, many of which had been refined through development. Human weapons were crude, and their tactics were untested. This so-called war would last perhaps a week before Earth recognized the futility of resistance. The Council voted to authorize a punitive expedition. They would destroy Earth's military capacity and install a provisional government more amenable to galactic law. The humans would be given 1 generation to prove they could behave properly. If they could not, then more permanent solutions would be considered. Commander Lisa received the Council's response while standing on the bridge of the carrier Resolute. She was a woman in her early 40s with dark hair pulled back in a tight braid and eyes that had seen too many simulations of battles they had hoped would never happen. Now the simulations were over, and the reality was about to begin. The Resolute carried a crew of 800 and a complement of strike fighters that had been designed in secret facilities buried deep beneath Earth's surface. The ship itself looked unremarkable from the outside, just another vessel in humanity's modest fleet. Its true capabilities had never been revealed to any alien observer. Lisa's fleet consisted of 12 ships. According to Council intelligence, this was roughly a quarter of humanity's total military strength. According to the truth, this was less than 1%. She gave the order to jump, and reality twisted around them as the Resolute and its companions entered the strange space between spaces that made faster-than-light travel possible. The journey would take 17 minutes, and at the end of it, they would emerge directly inside the home system. This should have been impossible. Every species in the galaxy used the same basic principles for interstellar travel, principles that required emergence at designated jump points located at safe distances from gravity wells. Attempting to exit faster-than-light travel near a planet or star was considered suicide. Humanity had spent 80 years proving that assumption wrong. The 12 human ships appeared less than 1,000,000 kilometers from the primary shipyard. The defensive fleet guarding the facility had been positioned to intercept enemies approaching from the standard jump points several hours away. They were facing entirely the wrong direction when the attack began. Lisa watched the tactical display as her strike fighters launched in perfect formation. The defenders scrambled to respond, but their command structure had never faced an enemy that refused to follow the established rules of engagement. Human pilots exploited their confusion with ruthless efficiency, targeting communication arrays and command vessels, while the main fleet advanced on the shipyard itself. 19 minutes after emergence, the primary shipyard was an expanding cloud of debris. 400 years of accumulated industrial capacity had been erased in less time than it took to brew a cup of tea. The human fleet suffered no losses. Simultaneously, Captain Young led his infiltration teams through the Council's communication relay network. His people had trained for this mission for years, practicing on mock-ups built from stolen schematics and intelligence gathered by agents who had spent their entire careers pretending to be harmless human tourists. The Council had never installed serious security protocols on their communication infrastructure. Why would they? No species had ever dared attack the Council directly. The relays had been operating for thousands of years without incident, and the idea that someone might actually want to sabotage them seemed absurd. And his teams moved through the stations like ghosts. They planted devices that would allow humanity to monitor every Council communication while simultaneously creating dead zones where human fleet movements would be invisible. The entire operation took less than 3 hours, and by the time it was complete, the Council had lost its eyes and ears across a third of the galaxy. On Earth, Karen Cooper stood before the United Nations General Assembly. The Great Chamber was filled to capacity with representatives from every nation, all of them waiting to understand what extermination protocol meant for humanity's future. Karen held her wedding ring in her palm as she walked to the podium. The ring was a simple band of gold that Daniel had given her on their 10th anniversary. He had apologized for not being able to afford something more elaborate, and she had told him that she would not trade it for all the jewels in the world. Now it was all she had left of him. She began to speak, and her voice did not waver. She explained that extermination protocol was not simply war. It was the complete and systematic dismantling of every species that had voted for her husband's death. Their fleets would burn. Their stations would fall. Their governments would collapse. Their capacity to ever threaten humanity again would be utterly destroyed. But it was not genocide, she told them. Humanity would not lower itself to the Council's level. The enemy populations would not be exterminated. They would be defeated so completely that they would have no choice but to accept humanity's terms. And those terms would include something the Council had never offered its victims. Those terms would include mercy. The General Assembly erupted in questions, but Karen simply raised her hand and waited for silence. She told them that her husband had died believing that compassion was strength. He had died believing that every species could be better than its worst moments. Proving him wrong would be a victory for the Council, and she would not allow that. When the war was over, humanity would offer the defeated species a chance to rebuild. They would be taught that there was another way to maintain order, a way that did not require executing prisoners for speaking truth. They would be shown the path that Daniel Cooper had believed in. And if they could not learn, then they would be contained until they could. Across the galaxy, the Council began to realize that something had gone terribly wrong. Reports flooded in of attacks on installations that should have been unreachable. Communication networks failed without warning. Defense fleets arrived at battle sites to find only wreckage and silence. The High Arbiter demanded explanations, but none of its advisors could provide them. Humanity's fleet was supposed to number 47 vessels. The attacks being reported would require hundreds of ships operating with perfect coordination across distances that should have made such coordination impossible. The Arbiter remembered Daniel Cooper's face in those final moments. It remembered the human's last words about humanity pleading guilty to the crime of compassion. It had dismissed those words as the bravado of a dying primitive. Now standing in its private chamber, watching the reports of destruction pile up, the Arbiter began to wonder if it had made a terrible mistake. 6 months into the war, the Galactic Council's numerical advantage had evaporated like morning dew under a burning sun. The ancient powers had expected a brief punitive campaign against primitive upstarts. Instead, they found themselves facing an enemy unlike anything the galaxy had ever encountered. Human tactics, every principle that had governed warfare for. Council species fought according to doctrines that had been refined over thousands of years, rigid formations and predictable maneuvers that had proven effective against every opponent they had ever faced. Humans ignored all of it. They attacked from impossible angles. They retreated when victory seemed certain only to reappear behind enemy lines. They learned from every engagement and evolved their strategies overnight, while their enemies clung to traditions that had become weaknesses. Admiral Christopher Blake had taken personal command of the final assault on the Council's capital station. The station orbited a dying star at the heart of the galaxy and had served as the seat of galactic government for over 30,000 years. Its shields were said to be impenetrable. Its defensive fleet numbered over 300 vessels. Its destruction would mean the end of Council authority forever. Blake's flagship was called the Endurance, a name he had chosen himself when the ship was commissioned decades ago. He had always believed that humanity's greatest strength was its refusal to surrender, even when surrender seemed the only rational choice. Now he intended to prove it. The approach to the capital station was a nightmare of defensive fire. Council ships threw themselves at the human fleet with desperate fury, and for the first time in the war, the enemy was fighting with everything they had. They knew what was at stake. They knew that if the capital fell, then everything they had built over 40,000 years would crumble into dust. The Endurance took the first major hit 3 hours into the assault. A dreadnought managed to penetrate the fleet's defensive screen and unleash a barrage directly into the flagship's port side. Entire decks were vaporized in seconds. The ship's primary weapons array went offline. Blake's officers urged him to fall back and transfer his flag to another vessel. The admiral refused. He told them that Daniel Cooper had not retreated when he faced death for speaking truth. He would not dishonor that memory by running now. The Endurance pressed forward. More damage accumulated as the hours passed. The ship's crew performed miracles of emergency repair, sealing breaches and rerouting power through systems that were never designed to carry such loads. They knew they were dying, but they also knew that every minute they survived brought the rest of the fleet closer to victory. Blake stood on a bridge that had become a ruin of sparking consoles and flickering lights. Half his command staff was dead. The other half worked with a calm focus that seemed almost supernatural. These were the people humanity had bred for this moment, warriors who had trained their entire lives for a war they hoped would never come. The capital station's shields were failing. Human ships had surrounded it completely, pouring fire into the defensive barrier from every direction. The Council fleet had been reduced to scattered remnants that fled or fought on in hopeless desperation. Blake gave his final order. The Endurance would crash directly into the station's primary shield generator. The impact would create an opening large enough for the assault teams to breach the hull. His remaining crew did not hesitate. They had always known this mission might require the ultimate sacrifice. They accelerated toward the station with the engines screaming in protest, aiming for a target that the ship's failing sensors could barely detect. The Endurance struck the shield generator at nearly 1% of light speed. The explosion was visible from orbit around worlds dozens of light years away. The shield generator and 3 surrounding support structures were instantly obliterated. A section of the station's hull was ripped open like paper. Admiral Blake and his entire crew were gone. Commander Lisa led the assault teams through the breach. She had transferred from the Resolute hours earlier specifically for this moment. Behind her came 300 of humanity's finest soldiers, each one carrying weapons designed to kill beings that were older than human civilization. The fighting inside the station was brutal and close. Council security forces defended every corridor with the desperation of creatures who knew their world was ending. Lisa lost soldiers at every intersection, watching men and women she had trained with fall to enemy fire. But the humans kept advancing. They moved through the station with a relentless determination that the defenders could not match. Every fallen soldier was avenged by those who followed. Every defensive position was eventually overwhelmed. Finally, they reached the council chamber itself. The great spherical room where Daniel Cooper had died was now sealed behind massive doors that had been designed to withstand planetary bombardment. Lisa's demolitions team went to work. Inside the chamber, the 12 representatives of the founding species waited in silence. The High Arbiter stood on its floating platform and watched the doors bulge inward with each explosion. It had lived for over 9,000 years. It had presided over the rise and fall of countless civilizations. It had never imagined that its own end might come at the hands of creatures it had dismissed as irrelevant. The doors finally gave way in a shower of molten metal. Human soldiers poured through the opening and fanned out across the chamber, weapons raised and ready. Lisa walked in behind them with her rifle pointed at the floor. She stopped in the center of the room where Daniel Cooper's platform had once floated. She looked up at the 12 representatives who had voted for his death. She saw fear in beings that had forgotten what fear felt like. The High Arbiter spoke with a voice that trembled for the first time in centuries. It offered territorial concessions. It offered resources beyond imagining. It offered formal apologies and guarantees of future cooperation. Lisa asked a simple question. She asked if the council could bring Daniel Cooper back. The silence that followed was answer enough. The representatives waited for execution. They had seen recordings of what humanity did to its enemies. They had watched their fleets burn and their stations fall. They expected no mercy because they had shown none. Lisa lowered her weapon. She told them that humanity was not here to kill them. Death would be a kindness they did not deserve. Instead, she would read them the terms of unconditional surrender. The terms were simple. The Galactic Council was dissolved permanently. Its authority would be transferred to a new governing body established by humanity. The former Council species would submit to complete demilitarization. They would accept human oversight of their governments. They would learn what it meant to live in a galaxy where compassion was not a crime. The High Arbiter listened to the terms and understood that everything its species had built over was being taken away. It asked what would happen if they refused. Lisa told the Arbiter to look around at the ruins of their power. She told them to count the bodies of their defenders. She told them to remember that humanity had achieved all of this in 6 months. Then she asked them to imagine what humanity could do if they were actually trying to be cruel. The Council accepted the terms. 1 year had passed since Daniel Cooper stood before the Galactic Council and spoke the word that cost him his life. In that year, the galaxy had been transformed so completely that the beings who had witnessed its previous state could barely recognize what remained. The Galactic Council no longer existed. Its great orbital station had been repaired and repurposed. Its chambers that once hosted the deliberations of ancient powers now filled with representatives of a new order. The station had been renamed Cooper Station, and it served as the capital of the Terran Protectorate, the governing body that humanity had established to replace everything the Council had built over 40,000 years. Karen Cooper stood in her office overlooking the main assembly hall. She was 51 years old now, with more gray in her hair than there had been a year ago. The weight of what she had witnessed and what she had helped to build showed in her face, but her eyes remained clear and determined. Those eyes had watched her husband die. They had watched humanity go to war. They had watched ancient civilizations crumble. And through it all, they had never lost sight of what Daniel would have wanted. Today was the anniversary of his execution, and today she would deliver her inaugural address as the first Chancellor of the Terran Protectorate. The speech had been written, and rewritten dozens of times. Every word had been chosen with care because every word would be broadcast to every inhabited world in the galaxy. The assembly hall was filled with representatives from hundreds of species. Some were human diplomats and military officers who had helped win the war. Some were members of the former council species who had surrendered and now sought to understand their place in the new order. Some were beings from worlds that had lived under council oppression for centuries and were still learning what freedom meant. Karen walked to the podium and waited for silence. The hall grew quiet with a speed that would have been impossible in the old council chamber, where representatives had spoken over each other for. She began by speaking of her husband. She told them about the man he had been before he became a symbol, the teacher who had spent 20 years helping children understand that the universe was vast and wonderful and worth exploring. She told them about his laugh and his terrible cooking, and his habit of staying up too late reading books about history. She told them that he had believed with every fiber of his being that compassion was the highest virtue any civilization could aspire to. Then she told them what humanity could have done after his death. The former council species had spent the past year waiting for the other shoe to drop. They knew how they would have treated a defeated enemy. They knew that by their own standards they deserved extermination. Every day they woke expecting to learn that humanity had finally decided to finish what the war had started. But humanity had not come to destroy them. Humanity had come to teach them. Karen explained that human educators were already working alongside populations across the former council territories. They were demonstrating that strength and mercy were not opposites but complements. They were showing that a civilization's true power lay not in its capacity for destruction, but in its willingness to build. They were proving that Daniel Cooper's death had not been in vain. The former council species were not enslaved or subjugated. Their people were not being punished for the crimes of their leaders. Instead, they were being given something the old council had never offered, the chance to become better than their worst moments. Karen paused and looked out across the assembly. She found the section where the representatives sat, their crystalline forms dimmed with what might have been shame or fear or something in between. She told them directly that humanity did not hate them. Hatred was easy. Hatred required no effort. What humanity had chosen was much harder. Humanity had chosen to believe that the beings who had killed Daniel Cooper could learn to be worthy of the mercy he had died defending. After the ceremony, the High Arbiter requested a private audience. The ancient being had been stripped of its rank but not its life, and it had spent the past year in a kind of bewildered contemplation that its species rarely experienced. It had presided over the deaths of millions across its 9,000 years of existence. It had never before been forced to consider whether any of those deaths had been wrong. Karen met the Arbiter in a small room overlooking the stars. She placed her husband's wedding ring on the table between them and sat in silence while the Arbiter gathered its thoughts. Finally, the ancient creature asked why. It asked why humanity had shown restraint when they had every reason to be cruel. It asked why Karen had not demanded the execution of the council members who had voted for Daniel's death. It asked why the species that had been wronged so deeply had chosen forgiveness over vengeance. Karen looked at the wedding ring and thought about the man who had given it to her. She remembered his last smile and his last words. She remembered how he had faced death without flinching, because he believed that even his killers could be better than their worst moments. She told the Arbiter that Daniel had believed in redemption. He had believed that every species could learn and grow and change. He had died believing that, and proving him wrong would have been a greater crime than anything the Council had committed. The Arbiter was silent for a long moment. Its crystalline form shifted and reformed as it processed emotions that it had no framework to understand. Finally, it asked what humanity wanted from the former Council species now. Karen picked up the wedding ring and slipped it back onto her finger. She told the Arbiter that she wanted them to learn how to show mercy, and then she wanted them to teach others. 100 years from now, she said there would be beings in the galaxy who had never known the old council's cruelty. Those beings would grow up understanding that compassion was strength and that justice did not require death. They would look back at the war between humanity and the council as a distant memory, a dark chapter that had led to something better. That was what Daniel would have wanted. That was what his death would mean. The Arbiter asked if humanity truly believed that such a future was possible. It asked if creatures who had killed without mercy for 40,000 years could truly learn another way. Karen smiled, and for the first time since her husband's death, the expression reached her eyes. She told the Arbiter that humanity had spent its entire history believing in impossible things. They had believed they could reach the stars when they were still bound to a single world. They had believed they could defeat the Council when they were outnumbered by hundreds to one. They had believed in mercy when the galaxy told them that mercy was weakness. Believing in the redemption of ancient enemies was simply the next impossible thing on the list. 3 months later, a monument was unveiled in the main concourse of Cooper Station. The statue depicted Daniel Cooper standing with his hand extended in greeting, exactly as he had stood when he first arrived as humanity's envoy. His face wore the gentle smile that Karen remembered from 1,000 ordinary moments, the smile of a man who believed in the goodness of others even when they gave him no reason to. Representatives from every species in the Protectorate gathered for the unveiling. Many of them had fought against humanity in the war. Many of them had supported the Council's decision to execute the human ambassador. Now they stood in silence as the cloth fell away, and Daniel Cooper's bronze face looked out across a galaxy he had helped to change. The inscription beneath the statue was simple. It read, "He asked for mercy, we answered." Karen stood in the crowd and watched beings from 100 worlds file past the monument. Some paused to read the inscription. Some reached out to touch the bronze hand extended in greeting. Some simply stood and stared as if trying to understand how one man's death could have led to the transformation of everything they knew. She thought about Daniel and what he would say if he could see what his sacrifice had created. She thought he would probably tell her not to make such a fuss over him. He would probably want to know if she had remembered to water the plants back on Earth. He would probably laugh and shake his head and tell her that the galaxy still had a long way to go. But he would be proud. She knew that much. He would be proud that humanity had answered cruelty with justice and vengeance with mercy. He would be proud that his death had given birth to something better than what came before. The galaxy would never forget what the Council had done. But more importantly, the galaxy would never forget how humanity had responded. They had responded with the only weapon that could truly change the universe. They had responded with hope,